been thinking about skills for the last sort of 9-12 months or so, in the context of other areas of work that I've been thinking about, technologies, precarious work in labour institutions. And I've been wondering about how we talk and research about skills. And it does seem to me that it's an area where perhaps economists have made some interesting and important contributions, especially through the human capital approach. But of course, that emphasizes a fairly one-dimensional approach to how we think about skills, and it affects the way in which we analyze problems, and there are major problems. So what I want to do today is set out some of these problems. I'll draw mostly on UK data, but I'm just using the UK as an illustrative case. Obviously, it's a particular type of labour market with a particular set of labour institutions, but I think it serves to illustrate some of the holistic nature to problems of skills. Now, I'm going to purposefully focus on the demand side. And in a way, that's part of my argument, that that's the side that's lacking, partly because the human capital approach pays far more attention to the educational side. Let's call it the supply side, if you like. And that's, I don't know whether that's ideological, methodological, or it's simply a result of the data that's available. There's far more data about education, qualifications, and number of years of work experience, for example, than what employers actually do with skills and how they develop them, right? So it's a bit like that old joke of the economists only looking for the 10-euro note underneath a street lamp in the night, not because they think it's there, but that's where the light is, and the rest of the street is dark. So you work with what you've got, you work with data you've got. So I want to purposefully think about the demand side. So most of my examples will be from the perspective of what's happening within the organization. But everything links and is joined up. So having said all that, so I want to set out 5 key problems. And again, I'm going to draw on data from the UK. And these are the 5 key problems. But there's been a great deal of education supply, and demand is lagging that supply of increased education. The other big problem is that skills in feminized jobs are undervalued. So skills are there, they're just not visible. The third is to do with the function of wages. Are wages fulfilling their allocative function in labour markets today? The fourth is whether or not we've got the labour institutions to suit the kinds of skill formation that we think we need, let's say for a high-skill knowledge economy. And the fifth is to do with the new technology question. So we used to talk about skill bias. Not many people are talking about skill bias anymore. The focus seems to be shifting to effort bias. You seem to have to work harder with new technologies rather than less. And, so what's happening there? I'll spend most of the talk going through those 5 interrelated problems. And then what I want to do is call for a kind of a more holistic interdisciplinary approach. So hopefully this is in keeping with your centre's ethos. And I want to set out these 4 pillars for an interdisciplinary approach to thinking about skills. One is that they should be seen to be as much a social policy as an economic policy. So skills are shaped by social structures. Second, they're bounded by an employment relationship. So it really does matter whether you're self-employed in a gig economy job or you're in a job for life in an organization. That really does matter for skills. The third is that the way an organization is structured really matters for skill as part of a wider thinking of knowledge. And that matters mainly for innovative performance, which is crucial for development of all economies. And the fourth is that we have to think about institutional drivers and the way they shape patterns of segmentation of skill, especially between low and high, and how they're distributed by workforce group, especially by gender, but also by disability, ethnicity, and others. So that's the gist of the talk. So let me just go through. So the first big problem, I think, that comes up in any approach is that we all know that the increase of supplies, just carries on increasing. But many countries are trapped in either low income traps or low skill traps. And there's a big question as to why demand has not responded flexibly enough to increase supply. So if I just give the brief case of the UK really followed the United States policy of focusing largely on higher education at the expense of technical and vocational education. There were experiments in the 50s, 60s, but they weren't long-lasting or deep-rooted enough. And we saw in the mid-60s a first phase of massification of higher education. It was very well funded. It was part of that then ethos of a distributive post-World War welfare state, which no longer exists in the UK. And we saw an increase in higher education cohort from 5% to 15%. So a significant massification, if you like, at that stage. Then this was repeated in the 1990s, but in a very different way. So again, we saw a focus on higher education, but this time with reduced public funding, with the introduction of student fees, very, very controversial at the time because it was done under a left-wing Labour government, although the acceleration of increases in fees happened under right-wing conservative-led governments. And crucially, the polytechnics, which used to focus a lot on intermediate skills, were rebranded and restructured to become universities. And this combination of policy reforms doubled the cohort attending universities during the 1990s, 17 to 34%. So that was when we saw the real higher education massification. But then that's increased and continued till today, with the latest OECD data showing that younger people 25 to 34, slightly more than half will have tertiary education. And you can see the results of previous years in that the people in the late 50s, early 60s, slightly more than a third have tertiary education in the UK. So huge increase on skills, and we don't question this. By the way, women's share of higher education more than doubled. So in the 50s, it was around a fifth, a quarter of higher education participants were women. Now it's well over half, and that's true, as you know, in many, many countries where women make up more than half of higher education. But in the last few years before the pandemic, 2013 to 17, the number of graduates entering the labour market increased by 15%. So this is a continuing trend. And UK, like other countries that have done this route, should be well on the way to a high-skilled knowledge economy if it was all about what was happening on the supply side with education. But unfortunately, it's not. So it's a big puzzle. And we know that employers are not upgrading the jobs, despite this apparent abundance of well-qualified labour. Now, there are lots of different takes on this, and it's not really a new puzzle either. So we can go back to the work of Lester Thurow and his job queue model, with this idea that there's a sort of a fixed set of good jobs, high-skilled jobs, and on the supply side, the best you can do is change your position in the queue. So the more qualifications, the higher up the queue get, but it doesn't mean you get a better job. It just means you've got a better chance of getting one of the good jobs that are available. And you might argue that there's still something of a job queue effect going on here. Other people talk about the problem of credentialism, that the credentials are valued rather than the skills. And there is perhaps a problem also that, or very likely to be a problem, that the education policy in many countries focuses on, if you like, easy to target remedies, like more university education or more this, more that, rather than trying to find new institutions to get employers to coordinate in the engagement in training. And that's proven very, very difficult in many countries. It's a harder institution to build and construct and sustain, it seems. So here's one bit of data in this graph saying that skill underutilization, which is fairly rife in all countries, you can see, probably looking for Poland there, but it's a much worse problem in the UK than others. And so while it might be fairly, it's nothing's perfect, people in the UK and the other countries to the right of the UK are bound to be worried about why is it such a problem? Why have you got more than 1 in 3 workers self-reporting that they've got skills to cope with more demanding duties in their job. And I think people tend to think this self-reported data is among the more reliable. The other data that we see a lot in the OECD and some of the National Statistics Office is this idea of whether you're over-educated or not. And we could have a debate about the difference between these terms. I think they are sort of politically loaded. Do you say the skills are underutilized, and what kind of policy reforms follow from that? Or do you say that people are over-educated, and that's likely to lead to a different set of policy reforms, right? I must say my preference is for saying that workers have skills that are underutilized. For me, that's the question. Why aren't there skills that exist being utilized? Overeducated seems to me you're only going to go down one path there. But here we show what's interesting about this graph is the upward trend for women. And that raises a big problem, right? So they're more and more likely to do higher education, and they're more and more likely to be in jobs where they're overeducated. This measure of overeducation, for those who are working on this, I mean, it's a bit of a dodgy measure, I think, because you basically ask what's the median level of education among workers in a 4-digit level of occupation. You do a 1 standard deviation around that median, and anybody above the 1 standard deviation is overeducated. But of course, it relies on the assumption that the median level of education is the right level of education for that occupation, but it could be that everybody's overeducated, right? I mean, so it's slightly problematic. Anyway, still, the trend, I think, gives us something to work with. Another indication that demand is lagging supply is that we're pumping out all these graduates, and many countries are doing the same, and the prospects have worsened. So we have to say, of course, what the pandemic showed us is that the risk of unemployment was far lower among graduates than non-graduates, and that's a very, very valuable outcome, right? So still hugely important to have graduate education, I think, as a buffer. However, you would expect other things to come into place too, and they haven't. So while in the 90s and early 2000s, we did see labour market in Britain absorbing this rise, or apparently absorbing this rise in graduates. We saw the emergence of new technical and managerial occupations, and there seems to be this whole rejigging of the labour markets as more and more graduates came through. But then in the 2010s, this slowed down to a halt. So by 2017, graduates were twice as likely as average to say, or to be defined as overeducated, around a third of them. So what we saw, if we look at the jobs, we saw that jobs that were that said they required a degree or a master's, a postgraduate qualification, there were around 29% of those in 2001, and that massively increased to 37% in 2012. But then it just stopped. That share stopped from 2012 all the way through to the start of the pandemic. So that's strange, and maybe that's it wasn't all about. We can't blame it on Brexit uncertainty. It hadn't happened yet. It's likely to do with technologies, but it could be something else too. Something to do with changing business strategy. We don't know. So there are similar trends in other European countries, and the work of Francis Green and Henseke show this. But whatever trends we're seeing are faster and higher, and at a worse level than in the UK than other countries. There are also, of course, differences by field of study, and one can break down the different elements of this. So whatever we're saying for all graduates is always worse for those with an arts education. And of course, that will have worsened considerably as a result of the pandemic. So that's my first sort of big problem. The second big problem with the way skills are acquired, used, and developed in all countries, but again, I'm giving UK examples, is that skills in feminized jobs are undervalued. I think this is now becoming more and more recognized, and I think the work of many people during the pandemic who were thinking about key workers or essential workers with a strong focus on care. Again, this is bringing this to light, but we're still not seeing enough policy action on this or responsiveness by employers. In previous work I've done with Jill Rubery, we define undervaluation as a situation when employers and/or society are able to access higher skills for a given wage. And it's another way of talking about exploitation, but we call it undervaluation. But again, we're trying to say and remind ourselves and everybody that the wage you get paid isn't necessarily a reflection of the skills that you're deploying in your job, right? So this goes above and beyond whether you think you're overeducated in the job. You can be overeducated in the job, but be paid according to the skills you use in your job. Here we're talking about using skills that are not recognized and not valued. That's undervaluation. So it's another level of problem. You can, of course, have both problems. And this does come out in the work of economists in the human capital wage regressions that show that women get a lower return to their education experience than men. That's just, discrimination or undervaluation. That these gender differences worsen with age. If you stick in the part-time worker variable, that increases the likelihood of undervaluation and sex discrimination. And mothers are especially at risk. I'm using this word sex discrimination. Those of you doing wage equations, of course, I know it's problematic to refer to the residual as discrimination because we don't have a measure of discrimination, of course, although there have been some studies where they ask employers a set of questions that can be moral discrimination, but I'm just calling it discrimination because it most likely is. What are the key features of undervaluation? Well, our work suggests the following 5 issues, especially problematic and can be seen as drivers of undervaluation. The one is that the economic activity where women are concentrated tends to be in low-paying firms in, let's call it, the secondary labor market. So it's a problem of the economic activity, whether this is in cleaning or social care or retail. The other is what I said before, the visibility of the skill and the status, and let's call that a social status or the political status, right? To what extent is this seen as a valuable skill in society? And it's often, women's work is often constructed as low skill, and their skills are not recognized or very little recognized. We did a huge bit of work on social care, and we were just staggered at the extent to which supervisors of care workers were hardly paid anymore. It was a matter of cents, let alone sort of 50% more, as we might expect in a professional career or in a male-dominated organization. The third is that there's a little bit of tendency in some of the economics, but also sociology work, to say that, well, it's low value because there's a compensating differential around job satisfaction. This kind of crazy idea that you like caring so much that you don't need to be paid for it, or you like serving customers in a cash till in a supermarket so much that you don't need to be paid for it, right? And there is some econometric work that tries to factor in a variable for commitment or for fulfillment or some other crazy thing. And sometimes that does eat into this residual, and they say, well, discrimination is actually not the big problem, it's this, right? I just find all that kind of stuff questionable. Of course, there's a whole other literature saying that women in part-time low-paid work are more satisfied than others. I know that, I'm aware of that, but it's all questionable. The fourth feature here is the low valuation of women's work associated with these outdated perceptions of women as second income earners. I think that's well versed. And the fifth is a low valuation that's embedded in pay hierarchies, either because they're separated out from other bargaining structures in a firm where there is bargaining, collective bargaining with trade unions, or there's a strange choice of wage comparisons, or this peculiar design. All those kinds of things we know also from work on outsourced contract cleaning are exacerbated where organizations take the decision to outsource female-dominated occupations, which happen a lot.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Martin, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, sure. What about the idea that maybe women are looking for more flexibility in their jobs and they're willing to sort of give up higher pay because they may have like family obligations or something like this?
Yeah, I just find that dubious. I mean, yeah, you can, I mean, there's some work where people put in those preferences. It's dubious because it's kind of a socially structured preference. So the question for me is, why is it that women are expressing those preferences and men not? Is it to do with Paternity leave, is it to do with the childcare that's available or not available, or costly or not costly? I mean, what are the other factors that shape those preferences? So yeah, we could chuck in a few preferences like that, and you're probably going to find that women do want to have some flexibility, etc. But when we've done work with social care workers and we asked them about that, and said, yes, we do value flexibility, and then we say, well, and do you get the flexibility that you actually want? No, right? So then there wasn't, even though they said they wanted to value flexibility, the flexibility they wanted wasn't. I mean, they wanted to say, well, you know, I want to work sort of 10 o'clock in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. But I want it to be fairly regular as well, and I don't have to work Thursdays, because then I don't have to pay for childcare on the Thursdays. But in the end, what they got was a 0 hours contract where they could be called in at any time. They were always constantly covering for other workers that were sick, and you know, it wasn't the right kind of flexibility either. So in the end, what would happen if you chuck that variable into a regression is that it would pick up it'd be bound to pick up some of the differentials in wages, but it wouldn't satisfy me as an explanation, given what I know from the qualitative responses. So yeah, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about, but I haven't been convinced. I don't know. I mean, the real question is why low-wage labor markets for women work completely differently to mid-wage and high-wage labor markets for men. That's the real question. And when people have separated out those different pools in the data, they find completely different dynamics. You know, you can get a wage premium for part-time work in high-wage markets, and a wage penalty for part-time contracts in low-wage, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think I'm more interested in those sort of segmented effects and where those effects come from. Yeah, but thanks. I mean, these are all good questions. Well, here's just some examples from work we did on motherhood penalties, where they control for all the variables one would expect, human capital and workplace characteristics, and come up with wage penalties, which increase with the number of children. The third problem, and I'm not sure in rereading what I've written about this, that I've got this quite right, but anyway, so I'll be interested in your reflections on this. What I originally thought was that there's a problem because real wages aren't keeping up with increasing skill supply, which means that the allocative function, I mean, wages do lots of things. They motivate, they're a reflection of social status, but they also allocate resources from one sector to another and give us the signal, if you like, as to where to invest in education skills. That's what they should be doing. So why is it then, in many countries, the premium for graduate labor has been declining? So this is kind of data for the UK. And what we find is that this was a particular decade, the worst decade for real wage decline in the UK sort of ever, certainly for the last century. But it was worse for graduates than for non-graduates, and it was worse for female graduates than anybody else. So what the hell kind of thing, I mean, what is going on there? You'd think if the labor market was suffering, those sort of graduates, would be able to keep their head above the water, but no. So you can see those figures and those percentage changes are worse in the top 2 rows than all the others, and systematically always worse for women, whichever group we look at. So does that mean that wages aren't working, or does it mean that, I don't know, now I'm wondering whether they actually are working. What all they're doing is saying that there's an excess supply of graduates. Demand isn't keeping up. So maybe I should have interpreted this differently and said, well, what's happening here is that wages actually are doing the job in the British labour market, and what they're signalling is that demand isn't keeping up, and employers can actually access graduate skills for cheaper, right? Because there's an excess supply. So maybe it's just a neoclassical story. I'd welcome your comments, but anyway, it comes back to the same story, which is demand isn't keeping up with supply. Why? Right? I mean, why aren't employers adapting? Is there a structural or other kind of institutional block to upgrading the labour market in Britain? The other sort of related problem is that the UK is well known, along with other countries, but I think especially the UK, along with its high inequality, the top end, is well known for a low wage, low skill, low productivity trap. This has been going on for decades, but this has not been resolved. And so one thing leads to another. So here we've got this classic kind of cycle, which has been reproduced by Francis Green and others, showing that you know, low-paid work really cycles around in a vicious cycle around limited opportunities, reduced demand for financial investment, and no changes in the kind of low value-added product markets. And I think that's very important, because if you don't shift the product market competition, you can't really get into a more virtuous circle. So the UK is still high up European ranking, although the last time I looked, Estonia, Germany, Latvia are slightly higher. But it's worth saying also that the low wage on an hourly measure in Britain has been falling. It was 21%, for example, in 2014. So 21% of all workers were paid less than 2/3 median on an hourly basis. And now that's down to 16%. And I'll say more about that in a moment. The fourth big problem, and again, this is very peculiar to the UK. It's less of a problem in a country like France or Germany or Sweden, where you find more coordinated and connected labor institutions and more encompassing and inclusive institutions. But I think Britain can be described as having underperforming, disconnected, and fractured labor institutions. If we take the minimum wage, I would hold this up as one single institution that works pretty well. The problem is that it's disconnected. It works almost in a kind of an institutional vacuum, and this is its major flaw. It's difficult to know how to fix it. So if you look at this, this is the level of the minimum wage relative to the median wage, and it's been steadily increasing. It was pretty flat for a long time in 2000s, but then there was a new government policy. They just stepped in and said, forget about all this tripartite consultation. We're going to tell you what to do. And this was a right-wing, conservative-led government. And they said, first, get it up to 60% of the median by 2020. That was done, more or less. And now they've said, get it up to 66% of the median hourly wage by 2024, right? And if that's done, it means there'll be no, on an hourly measure, there'll be no low wage work in Britain. Quite impressive. So you could say that institution is working. And of course, that should encourage what we used to say when we were arguing for minimum wages in the mid-90s. We used to say, well, that'll encourage skill investment. It'll send a nice wage signal to employers. If you pay more, then you should try and get more productivity. So you invest more in skills, technologies, and shop, and so on. At the same time, the problem is that the government's also been encouraging, quite explicitly, precarious work, flexible work. And I say it's an explicit encouragement because every time people call for regulations on new standards, they say, no, we don't need them. Flexible labor market is our comparative advantage, but of course, it's not, it's a comparative disadvantage. When we look at low wage work by weekly pay, there's been no change at all. And it's precisely because we've got this new variability and irregularity of hours of work. And the most famous thing is the 0 hours contract. And that's just massively boomed. And could say that's in part a business response to the rising minimum wage. I think it was also slightly a response to the EU directive on agency work, which introduced new powers to equalize wages and conditions. Where that goes, of course, in the future is anybody's guess. We also know there's a big problem of people with non-standard contracts like agency work, 0 hours contracts, and even self-employed. To some extent, you could throw those in here too, that they want more work. So this is really another indication of underemployment. And so like developing countries, the problem in Britain is not unemployment, because we don't have much of a welfare state to compensate if you're unemployed. So nobody wants to be unemployed because you have to live on nothing, like a developing country. But what we do have are lots of people doing any kind of work, especially informal work or informal self-employed or false self-employed, exactly like developing countries. This is our big indication of underemployment. So when I was at the ILO, we switched from using unemployment as an international measure of labor market performance because it doesn't apply to so many countries in the world. And I was there while we were developing new ways of thinking about underemployment and underutilization. And the UK, I think, has to be seen like this, and many other countries too in Europe, similarly. The other fractured, a major fractured, sort of punctured institution is trade union representation. I just show this graph. Again, this is true in many countries, that the public sector has held quite high representation of trade unions. What trade unions can do in the public sector during austerity, of course, has been massively limited. But in the private sector, it's been low for many, many, many decades now. The golden era is long gone. It's around private sector union density. It's around 14% now. Most trade union members overall are women and have been for a long time now. So it's no surprise that the head of our trade union confederation, as one peak union confederation, is a woman. And that represents quite well, I think, the union membership.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Could you maybe remind us what's the unit of trade union density?
The unit. What do you
yes,
mean?
What is it expressed in?
Sorry, that's just the proportion of workers in a trade union, and the denominator is all workers.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Peculiar term, non-union density. And the fourth institution I would point to, which is relevant to the UK as well, I think, and perhaps other countries, and this is precisely because we focused on the massification of higher education as a way of solving the skills problem, which we didn't. There's hardly any work in strengthening and developing vocational and technical education and training. So, and the work there is and has been very patchy and fragmented. Many scholars have been writing about this over the years. The latest nice study is by a colleague here at King's, Chiara Benassi, and Johan Fortwangel and others. And they're really saying that this is now ought to be seen as a comparative institutional disadvantage, that we don't have institutions to fill these mid-level skills, which, yeah. So whenever I read, I mean, I'm going into the next point now, but whenever I read about the job polarization caused by technologies, I always think, but it's not the technologies that are causing the job polarization. It's the absence of institutions that deliver intermediate skills. And in Britain, there's been a restriction and cutbacks of funding to those institutions for years. So it's no surprise that it's actually feeding through into the labour market. I don't see it as an issue of necessarily only technologies. So turning to technologies, this is the fifth and final sort of problem that I wanted to alert you to. And this is that the assumed skill bias of technologies is either absent, weak, and it's certainly unevenly distributed. So not everybody can assume they'll benefit from this. And this is completely different to the way it was in most of the 20th century. And even really up until quite recently. But work of the last sort of 5-10 years has really been questioning the universality of skill bias. Now, we know that one of the big problems with a lot of the digitized automation is that many people are going to lose jobs. That's without doubt. I don't think we're not expecting, half to 2/3 of jobs to go, like some people were saying 10 years ago or so. But nevertheless, there will be job losses. But the real problem is the distribution of those job losses. So it's very unequally distributed by age, as that top graph shows. So with most of the high risk among the very young, as well as older, 60 to 65, and also by educational level. You can see the bottom graph there showing that most of the high risk is borne by those with lower than the GCSE is a qualification taken at the age of 16, A level at the age of 18. But you can see those with degree or other form of higher education are more likely to be in the low risk and medium risk categories. There's a big gender difference in whose jobs are at risk. And this is primarily caused by women's concentration in jobs with a high incidence of routinized tasks. And again, not because women have the skills that allow them to flourish in those kind of jobs, but more because the jobs are organized in a way that the tasks are narrow and routinized because the value of those jobs is so low. So that's, sort of there's a real outcome of undervaluation and sex segregation in the labor market. We're going to see women more likely to lose jobs than men because of new technologies over the medium term. And the part-time, full-time split, which is related to that, follows. We know, of course, that the skill bias is tempered by a non-routine task bias. So if you've got a job with non-routine tasks, cognitive or manual, you're more likely to win, and vice versa. And this has been shown by many works on job polarization. Alan Manning's work is one of those. But again, I always question the sort of loss of jobs in the middle, I think, is the wide-ranging factors there. And the other very interesting work, I think, on technologies and the real effects in the labor market come from Francis Green and others. And they show quite clearly that those jobs that involve higher skills and more likely to work with computers are registering an increase in work intensification, what they call an effort bias. And they argue quite strongly that we're not seeing the skill bias, but we are seeing effort bias. And that's really a problem. If we're interested in well-being at work, if we're interested in work-life balance at work, working hours, and the extent to which you've got to keep working to keep up living standards. These are major issues. If we take the new technology paradigm to an extreme, I think the most extreme form is these so-called microtask jobs, which are proliferating around the world now, with organizations in all sectors of economic activity finding ways to outsource small bundles of jobs, which are then outsourced onto a platform like Amazon Mechanical Turk, and unbundled into thousands of microtasks, and then those are auctioned on platforms, and anybody can pitch to do it from wherever they are in the world and get paid peanuts to do each task, and they end up spending half the time looking for a task to do with no money, and then they get to do the task. They might be paid, they might not, depending on how the client ranks the work. So there are very kind of interesting reputation and ranking and evaluation effects. And this is all invisible work. It's not like the location-based platforms that we see in Uber, Deliveroo, and so on. So I think the ILO has been at the forefront of doing this work. And this was just an example of one of the tasks where a person has to, type in what they read on this. We like to think a machine's done this automatically, but of course, most of this is still done by people. There's a bit of a lag around machine learning here. And in the meantime, there's lots of de-skilled work happening, which raises lots and lots of questions. A lot of these people doing this work are graduates, by the way, especially in developing countries, where it's still better and better paid than the alternative. So that's my run through of a set of interrelated problems. And I just want to end quickly with where I see kind of future research and future sort of illuminating points of analysis. And I worked on this with my colleague, Marcela Miozzo, because we were asked to think about this for a new productivity institute, which is trying to think about the role of skills in new pathways for inclusive development. So the first message, I think, from reading the literature is that skills have first and foremost to be thought of as being shaped by social structures. And this is not only because of the strong gender lines of segmentation and the way in which societies structure and value and design skills around jobs, but also many others. So, for example, for the last 20 years or so, many governments have been talking about the knowledge economy, and that just gives a real boost to things like creative problem-solving skills and analytical skills and communication skills in a way that we didn't really have before, right? So that was as much a kind of a political economy or social structuring of skills than some rigorous analysis of what was happening on the demand side. And the other one is that, many countries really do give a lot of attention to craft skills or an apprenticeship, and really think about long-term rooted skills that have longevity to them. And other countries just let them go, erode them, abolish them, and don't nurture those things at all. And I think they're rooted in societal structures more than sort of if you like some sort of supply and demand curve. Third is the soft skills. Again, that's something that's had a lot of attention. Researchers have looked a lot at emotional labor, for example, or creative skills and how they're valued and whether they're valued fairly. Women's equal status, I think they've talked about. And that's related now to this new attention, very welcome attention, I think, to ideas about essential work and how the idea of essential work translates into not only, people clapping their hands every time they see a health and social care worker, but, actually changing value structures or having new sort of cross transfers of resources from sort of, if you like, high tech, high profit sectors to low tech, low profit sectors. And I think there needs to be more of a conversation in societies about those cross subsidiary rules around countries. I don't, whether you do it through tax structures or otherwise, remains to be seen. The second principle for me for interdisciplinary research on skills is to always couch the skill structure and the skill formation system within an employment relationship. And that might be a strong standard employment relationship or a precarious one, but that needs to be thought through. Because in most countries, while some collective bargaining arrangements do help shape these things, most countries don't have collective bargaining arrangements for the majority of their workforce. So we have to think about the employer's willingness, usually unilaterally, to delegate authority or to foster worker autonomy, to do all the things that we think are good for skill development, skill incentives and skill formation, but which are often missing. And we have to ask the question, why are those missing? We know from the work of David Marsden, but also Herbert Simon, that open-ended employment relationships provide, if you like, more natural functional flexibility, so you can adapt, because you never know what's going to happen around the corner, so you don't write it into a contract, you've got the space to develop and change. And we know that differs across countries, but we also know that that's threatened by more precarious employment forms, or a disposable labor market, as we called it recently in the paper with Jill Rubery. And that does pose risks to an undermining of investment, obstructs innovation, and impedes performance growth. We know all these things from the literature. So how do we shape policy in a way that can address these concerns? And also I think the employment, if we think about the employment relationship, we're always reminded of the essential conflicts and tensions. So we have to ask who's paying for the skills and who's bearing the risks. And of course, we see that with this big legal contest now as to whether gig economy workers should be self-employed or workers. It's a lot about who's paying for the employment relationship. So let me skip this. This was just a set of work I was reviewing by Mick Marchington, who was really reminding us of the tensions, so that even when it seems that employers and workers agree that, here are my goals, here are your goals, let's have some worker voice to address these, there are still, contested notions, for example, of what a worker or an employer thinks of as autonomy or responsibility. And so I think these need to be aired and thought through. The third principle is that I think it makes sense to think of skill, which is, the more you think about skill, the more weird term it is. But anyway, think about skill as bound up with maybe knowledge and knowledge structures and knowledge flows, and how that is shaped by innovation. So there's a lot of really nice literature that reminds us that the way in which an organization is shaped and formed and how it structures different bits of work and divisions and units and different workforce groups really matters for our thinking about career pathways or opportunities for skill development or opportunities for sharing, learning within a team, cross-functional teams or cross-organizational teams. And all these things turn out to be really, really important and help us think about it. So if a big firm is talking about their training, but then it turns out that they're outsourcing all their low skill work or all the medium skill work, that's really going to matter for our policy approach, I think, to thinking about what businesses are doing, and that's investigated in a bunch of different research. I'm going to skip that. I can come back if you like. I feel like I'm running out of time. The fourth is that, and the final one I would appeal for, is to think about the way in which the surrounding institutions of a skill formation system address, enhance, or reduce inequalities in a labor market. So I think the inclusiveness of labor institutions is very, very important. So whether we're thinking about employment protection that protects employees, very strictly defined, or extends to self-employed, whether we're thinking about vocational training, so there might be levies on firms of different sizes, but then how do you subsidize those who aren't subject to a levy? bring them into the equation. How do you make sure you've got equal and shared access to all types of training provision by type of contract, whether you're subcontracted, freelance, part-time, etc. And also, how does all this relate to what we used to call an industrial policy? So can you just have a high-skill, high-wage labor market by appealing to one in a voluntarist fashion, like we're hearing a lot at the moment in the British government, or do you have to try to work something out institutionally with new rules and new stakeholders, both on the employer side and on the workforce side? So to conclude, I think from my reading of skill problems I don't think my first impulse would be to change institutions on the supply side. It would be to ensure that employers are holding their side of the bargain. I don't think they have been doing. I think it's a bigger job to get employers to respond, but I think it's the one I would focus on. And I've gone through those 5 problems. And what I'm calling for, I suppose, is a new set of policy actions which build on interdisciplinary research, because I think that kind of research is better at getting inside the organization to understand the way in which skills are acquired, used, developed, transformed, adapted, and so on in a constantly evolving way, especially in light of new technologies. Thanks very much.